The story of the Garden of Eden is one of those passages that just gets stranger and stranger the closer you examine it. Its geographic details in particular occupy a surprisingly prominent and lengthy portion of the Eden story, teasing us with the possibility that Eden could be a real place, and not just a land of the imagination. But does the Bible provide enough detail for us to deduce a specific location? This is the question I'll be focusing on in this video. The quest to locate Eden requires us to view the world through the eyes of the ancients. Along the way, we'll examine the 4 rivers of Eden, the sacred mountain of El, the cosmic ocean at the edge of the world, and other exotic places described both in the Bible and in the ancient literature of the Near East. I hope that the journey is just as interesting as the destination. The story of Eden that is familiar to most people is found in Genesis 2. This passage begins by describing the newly created world as a barren land with no vegetation or crops, for there is no rain and no one to till the ground. 2 things happen to change this. First, a spring wells up from the ground to water the earth. Next, Yahweh forms a man from the soil and breathes life into him. His purpose is to till the barren ground. Then, starting in verse 8, the passage describes Yahweh creating a garden. The garden itself is not called Eden, but it is planted in Eden in the east. Presumably, this means east of Palestine, which could be, well, a lot of places. This garden is not a formal flower garden, but something more like a forest. In verse 9, Yahweh fills it with trees that are pleasant to the sight and good for food. In the center, of course, are the tree of life and the tree of knowledge. Those are a topic for another day. Verse 10 says a river flows out of Eden to water the garden, and from there it divides and becomes 4 branches. Presumably this river originates from the spring described earlier. The next 3 verses name the 4 rivers and furnish some geographical details. I'll tackle them one at a time. The name of the first river is Pishon. It is the one that flows around the whole land of Havilah, where there is gold, and the gold of that land is good. Bdellium and shoham stone are there. The first river has always been something of a mystery, since there is no record of any river called the Pishon. However, the name Havilah is more helpful. It is mentioned once in the Bible as the land of the Ishmaelites, who were an Arab tribe, and once as the land of the Amalekites. This implies a swath of territory ranging from the Sinai Peninsula to southwestern Arabia. There was apparently also a tribal federation called the Haulan in that region. Thus, the consensus is that the Pishon is not an actual river per se, but the waters that encircle the Arabian Peninsula, the Red Sea, the Arabian Gulf, and the Persian Gulf, or, more generally, the waters at the edge of the world. In the ancient Near East, the same word that meant river could also refer to the sea, especially the great ocean that surrounded the continents. On the famous Babylonian map of the world, for example, the ocean that encircles the world is called the Bitter River. Danel Khan of the University of Haifa has recently suggested that the name Pishon might come from the Egyptian Pa-Shen, meaning the ocean. What about the gold, bdellium, and shoham? The Table of Nations in Genesis 10 associates Havilah with Ophir, an unidentified location known for its gold. Bdellium was the resin of the balsam tree from southern Arabia and Somaliland, which was used as incense. It's not known for certain what kind of stone shoham is. Most English translations say onyx, but some scholars suggest the carnelian, a red gemstone that can be found in Egypt and eastern Arabia. While these trade goods point to the Red Sea and Persian Gulf regions, one has to ask what importance, if any, they have to the story. Maybe the intent was just to emphasize the exotic nature of the distant places reached by the rivers of Eden, and to emphasize that real places are being described, not just mythical geography. The name of the second river is Gihon. It is the one that flows around the whole land of Cush. Cush is the Hebrew name for ancient Nubia, the land along the upper reaches of the Nile River. Thus, the Gihon is almost certainly the Nile. This conclusion is strengthened by the Septuagint, which renders Gihon as Gaon, and applies the same name to the Nile in Jeremiah 2:18. We might ask why the author would choose this name over the normal Hebrew names for the Nile. One possibility has to do with the fact that there is a spring in Jerusalem also called the Gihon. Thus, even though the Nile is intended, readers are invited to associate Eden with Jerusalem and its temple. The name of the third river is Tigris, which flows east of Assyria, and the fourth river is the Euphrates. The last two rivers hardly need explaining. They are the rivers of Sumer, Babylon, Akkad, and Assyria, the great civilizations of Mesopotamia in whose shadow the Israelites lived. In Hebrew, the Tigris is called the Hidekel, which comes from the Akkadian Idiklat and ultimately originates with Sumerian. The author notes that the Tigris flows east of Assur, which could refer either to the city of Assur, which was on the west bank of the Tigris, or to the entire land of Assyria. The Euphrates is called Perat in Hebrew, from Puratu, which is the Akkadian pronunciation of the Sumerian cuneiform. The importance of these two rivers to the Eden story may go beyond their geographical significance. In Mesopotamian mythology, the Paradise of Dilmun was said to be located near the mouths of the Tigris and Euphrates, a connection that I'll come back to. It should be obvious, without even looking at a map, that these four rivers do not have a common source. The Nile is not even on the same continent as the Tigris and Euphrates, and the Pishon is not a true river. Some religious apologists argue that these names apply to different rivers before Noah's flood, but that is simply not plausible, since the Akkadian names used in Genesis would not have existed until Akkadian-speaking people migrated to Mesopotamia, and Akkadian became the lingua franca in the Levant under Assyrian domination. There's also the matter that rivers don't divide at their headwaters. Rather, they come from smaller tributaries that merge together as they flow downhill. So from a rational, scientific viewpoint, there is not, and has never been, any location where a single river could split into these four watercourses. And perhaps that's to be expected, since the story that takes place in Eden is a theological myth and not literal history. However, we shouldn't give up on locating Eden just yet. This description would not have been problematic to an ancient audience, because people at the time had very different ideas about how rivers worked and where they came from. For example, the ancient geographer Pausanias reported that the Euphrates was thought to disappear into the marshes of southern Mesopotamia and rise to the surface again in Ethiopia, where it became the Nile River. Alexander the Great reportedly believed that he had discovered the upper course of the Nile when he first came across the Indus River in the distant east. Egyptian priests reportedly said that the Nile had its origin in the ocean that surrounded the inhabited world. The philosopher Plato, in his work titled Phaedo, describes how the bottomless chasm of Tartarus is like a pump that feeds four great rivers which rise to the surface through various hollows and diverge to create the familiar waterways of our world. In other words, the people of that era imagined that seemingly unconnected rivers could have common sources in distant lands or subterranean caverns. From that perspective, an ancient reader could easily believe that the Tigris and Euphrates were connected to the Nile and to the Southern Ocean. With this viewpoint in mind, a look at similar Near Eastern myths and related Jewish traditions both inside and outside the Bible might shine further light on where Eden is supposed to be located. Israel's older neighbors in Mesopotamia and Syria had myths about places that sound similar to Eden. Sumerian and Akkadian tablets frequently mention a paradise called Dilmun. One Sumerian tale called Enki and Ninhursag includes a creation story in which Dilmun is transformed by the god Enki from a barren desert into a verdant paradise for the gods, using language and themes similar to those found in Genesis 2. In particular, Enki causes a well to spring up from the earth to water the land. Now, we know from ancient trading records that Dilmun was a real place. It seems to have been a prosperous mercantile kingdom located along the Arabian coast of the Persian Gulf in the late 3rd millennium BCE, and the name was eventually associated with the island of Bahrain. Bahrain's location in the Persian Gulf, the biblical Pishon, near the mouths of the Tigris and Euphrates, isn't a bad fit for Eden. However, Sumerian and Akkadian stories also use the name Dilmun to describe a separate mythical place that is located in the east where the sun rises. In the Sumerian flood epic, Dilmun is the dwelling place of the immortal hero Ziusudra. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, this land is said to be at the mouth of the rivers, beyond a great sea called the Waters of Death. It is generally thought that the rivers are supposed to be the Tigris and Euphrates. The theme of God dwelling at the conjunction of the rivers is also found in Ugarit, a Bronze Age city-state to the north of Israel. According to the religious texts discovered there, the high god El dwells on a mountain that is described as being at the source of the rivers at the meeting of the two deeps. The two deeps are probably the cosmic waters above the firmament and below the earth. This would suggest that El's sacred mountain is at the edge of the world, but also somehow connected to the world's great rivers, like Eden. The idea that paradise can be found at the eastern edge of the world is also reflected in the Book of Enoch. In chapter 32, Enoch must go beyond the Erythraean Sea to the eastern end of the world to reach Eden. The Erythraean Sea was the ancient name for the waters of the Red Sea, Persian Gulf, and Indian Ocean, the Pishon of Genesis. It's where the modern country of Eritrea gets its name, in fact. One lesson we should learn from these examples is the way that ancient writers could freely mix mythological places with real-world geographical features such as rivers, even if such connections would make no sense from our modern perspective. There's a second paradise motif in Near Eastern literature that is relevant to Eden. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, the titular hero Gilgamesh, in his search for immortality, sets out to find the mystical Forest of Cedars, where he is supposed to kill its guardian, a monster named Humbaba. The forest is on a mountain that is said to be where the Anunnaki, the old Babylonian sky gods, dwell. The cedars are exceedingly tall, and one version says that the forest is full of delight, a description reminiscent of the name Eden, which also means delight. Gilgamesh defeats Humbaba and cuts down the forest's tallest cedar. Compare this to how Eden is described in the book of Ezekiel. Chapters 28 and 31 preserve an Eden myth that appears to predate Genesis 2. Although Ezekiel is merely using Eden as a metaphor in these oracles, we can see the outlines of the underlying myth by setting aside the secondary elements. Ezekiel 31 compares Pharaoh to the greatest cedar of Lebanon. It says, "The cedars in the garden of God could not compare with it. Cypresses could not match its boughs, and plane trees could not vie with its branches. No tree in the garden of God was its peer in beauty. All the trees of Eden envied it in the garden of God. Its roots reach down to the subterranean cosmic waters, and rivers pour out from its base. However, because of its vanity, the cedar is cut down, and all the trees of Eden descend into the netherworld." Ezekiel 28, an oracle to the king of Tyre, describes Eden as the garden of God, or the gods, and locates it on a holy mountain. This passage is a bit more challenging to decipher because the portions about the king being directly created by God and placed in the garden with the vestments of royalty apparently come from a Babylonian text, DAT 17019. However, these two passages from Ezekiel, taken together, reflect a myth that depicts Eden as a forest of cedars called the Garden of God, or the Garden of the Gods, just as in the Gilgamesh story. This forest is located on a sacred mountain in Lebanon. The roots of its greatest tree reach down to the cosmic ocean below the world, and rivers gush out of it. The sacredness of cedar forests and the importance of using cedars from Lebanon for building temples and palaces is well established in Mesopotamian records. Cedars from Lebanon are also an essential component of Solomon's temple in the Bible. Another passage that shows awareness of this cedar forest myth is 2 Kings 19, which quotes a boast by Assyrian king Sennacherib. "With my many chariots, it is I who have climbed the highest mountains, the remotest parts of Lebanon, and have cut down its tallest cedars, its choicest cypresses. I have reached his farthest lodge, his densest forest." As Noga Ayali-Darshan points out in a 2017 paper, the phrases "his farthest lodge" and "his densest forest" must be referring here to God and his dwelling place in the cedar-forested mountains of Lebanon. The exact location of the cedar forest varies in different texts. Sometimes it is associated with the Amanus Mountains near the border between modern Turkey and Syria. In others, it is said to be the Lebanon Mountains, though exactly which peak is not clear. There are actually two mountain ranges in this part of the Levant, the Lebanon and the Anti-Lebanon, whose highest peak is Mount Hermon. Mount Hermon's connection with the divine goes back millennia, and its very name means sacred. Its association with God is found in passages like Psalm 42, which reads, I remember you from the land of Jordan and of Hermon, from Mount Mizar. Deep calls to deep at the thunder of your torrents. This intriguing description connects the Jordan River to the cosmic oceans above and below the world, which all converge at Mount Hermon. Orientalist Edward Lipinski notes that in the Hittite Empire, Mount Hermon was sometimes invoked as a divine guarantor for international treaties. The heavenly proximity of Hermon is also reflected in 1 Enoch 6, as it is on the summit of Hermon where the angel Semyaza and his followers swear an oath to take human wives. This might be the same mountain alluded to in Psalm 48, which describes God's holy mountain as being Mount Zion in the recesses of the north. There is another potential connection in Isaiah 14, which describes the Mount of the Assembly, that is, the mountain where the divine council of God meets, as being in the recesses of the north. Verse 8 even associates this mountain with the cedars of Lebanon. We may also point to Psalm 133, which compares Aaron's oil to the dew of Hermon which falls on the mountains of Sion, where Yahweh reigns. However, given the mixing of different mythological traditions in these passages, we cannot be certain which mountain is intended. From this brief survey, it appears that Eden in the Bible reflects two separate Near Eastern myths. The older depiction of Eden in Ezekiel is based on the myth of a divine mountain of cedars in the Levant, for which Mount Hermon is a good fit. This cedar forest shows up as a sacred abode of the gods in a variety of ancient texts, but most famously the Epic of Gilgamesh and the Egyptian tale of two brothers, which I have not had time to get into here. The other biblical Eden is connected with the myth of Dilmun. It is located far to the east at the source of four great rivers. I think E. Noort is correct when he writes that, through geography, the author wants to demonstrate the reality of paradise, but he also wants to show that it is inaccessible. One can get from Eden to the mundane world, but the reverse journey is not possible. Whether this inaccessible location is in a sacred cedar forest to the north of Israel, in the mountains of eastern Turkey where the Tigris and Euphrates originate, or on a mystical mountain beyond the sea at the eastern edge of the world, is impossible to decide from the text of Genesis 2 alone. So I invite the viewer to draw their own conclusion. Thanks for watching.
Bit of an overreaction, if you ask me. I can't see what's so bad about knowing the difference between good and evil anyway.
Well, it must be bad. Otherwise, you wouldn't have tempted them into it.